Fasting and when we eat influences a large range of aspects of our health and well-being. Intermittent fasting impacts weight loss, fat loss in particular, muscle maintenance, gut health, and liver health, the genome, the epigenome, inflammation, sickness, recovery, and healing, exercise, cognition, mood, and lifespan. There actually is a perfect diet for you. Let's come up with the ideal intermittent fasting schedule for you. We're going to talk about how fasting and when we eat influences a large range of aspects of our health and well-being, both physical and mental. Well, nowadays, most people are familiar with the term intermittent fasting, also sometimes called time-restricted feeding. I think most people don't really understand how that process works. It's sort of obvious that intermittent fasting, aka time-restricted feeding, involves eating at certain periods of each 24-hour cycle, or maybe even not eating for entire days in some cases. But if you think about it, everybody sleeps eventually, and therefore, because people don't eat during their sleep, almost everybody is employing some form of intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. What we're going to talk about today is how particular schedules of time-restricted feeding can impact our health in different ways. And when I say different ways, I mean we're going to talk about how intermittent fasting, aka time-restricted feeding, impacts weight loss, fat loss in particular, muscle maintenance and loss and gain, organ health, such as gut health and liver health, the genome, the epigenome, inflammation, sickness, recovery, and healing from sickness, exercise, cognition, mood, and lifespan. It's very clear from both animal studies and human studies can have a very powerful and positive impact on everything from weight loss and fat loss to various health parameters. This is a beautiful literature that's emerged mostly in the last 10 or 15 years. And as we march into this literature, what you'll see is that there actually is a perfect diet for you on a given day. And that perfect diet for you on a given day is contextual, meaning it depends on what you did yesterday and what you're going to do tomorrow. So there is a perfect diet for you, and today I'm going to arm you with the mechanisms and understanding that will allow you to define what that perfect diet is and will allow you to eat on a schedule and to eat the things that are going to best serve your goals. Let's come up with the ideal intermittent fasting, aka time-restricted feeding schedule for you. And when I say ideal, I mean what are the variables that are negotiable? What are the ones that are non-negotiable? What is ideal for you will depend on the context of your life and what you are willing to do consistently. So, first of all, we established, based on the discussion with Sachin, who is truly the premier world expert in this area, who knows the animal and human scientific literature better than anybody, has written this incredible review, and for whom I consulted, that you do not want to ingest food for at least, I want to emphasize, at least 60 minutes post waking up. Second, you want to avoid ingesting any food of any kind, even 1 gram of sugar. He also mentioned, ideally, you are spending 8 hours in bed. Ideally, you are sleeping that entire 8 hours, but simply by being in bed for that 8 hours and avoiding food after waking for an hour and before bed for 2 to 3 hours, you're starting to build out the duration of this fasted period. Remember that the sleep-related fasting is particularly important for the health benefits of time-restricted feeding. Again, the sleep-related fasting is especially important because of all the cellular repair processes that occur in the liver, in the gut, in the microbiome, in the brain, all over the body, and because of the way that that coordinates the expression of the clock genes that are then going to wick out and have many other positive effects on health, including weight and fat loss, but in addition to that, liver health, etc. An 8-hour feeding window as a target seems to be the best target feeding window, at least by my read of the literature and in discussing it with Sachin. Shorter feeding windows of 4 to 6 hours tend to lead to overeating and potentially increases in weight. 1 meal per day type eating do not seem to do that, but those are special cases in that most people can't adhere to a 1 meal per day, at least not on a regular basis, and it's not very compatible with most social schedules, although some people may be able to adhere to that in a straightforward way, but there aren't any robust studies exploring the advantages of one meal per day. So if you feel there are advantages of one meal per day for you, as opposed to an 8-hour feeding window, well then by all means, use a 1 meal per day approach, or use a 4 to 6 hour feeding window and just make sure you don't overeat in that window. Remember that most people tend to not adhere to the 8-hour feeding window. They say 8 hours, but they tend to eat outside of the 8 hours a little bit on each side. So if your goal is a 10-hour feeding window, you might want to set it to 9 hours or 8 hours. If your goal is 6 hours, you might want to set it to 7 or 8 hours. And this is simply based on thousands, if not tens of thousands of human subject data points that Sachin and colleagues have collected. Regular placement of the eating window or feeding window every 24 hours is important. You don't have to be absolutely rigid and neurotic about this, but you don't want it sliding around on the weekend so that it's starting 2 hours later and ending 2 hours later a couple days a week, because then you start to offset many of the positive health effects that have been demonstrated for time-restricted feeding. Remember, if you eat your food within a certain feeding window, but that feeding window shifts by a couple hours, it is effectively like jet lagging your system. It is effectively like traveling a couple time zones over, eating there for a few days and coming back, when in fact you're not traveling. And that's because of the way that food adjusts these circadian clock genes. Now, you can offset some of that through the use of light, and I've talked extensively about how to use light, but again, early morning and all day bright light exposure as safely as you can, ideally from sunlight, not through a window, etc. Avoiding bright light in the middle of the night, extremely important for mood, offsetting metabolic dysfunction, etc. Not incidentally, Sachin's early work he was one of the 3 co-discoverers of the cells in the eye, the so-called melanopsin cells that set the central circadian clock. So he was a pioneer in that field, which led him to be a pioneer in this field, and so on. When should that 8-hour window be placed within each 24-hour cycle? Well, let's talk about ideal. Ideal, if you really want to maximize all the health benefits of time-restricted feeding, you need to extend the fast around sleep on both sides. You would place it smack dab in the middle of the day. It would be a schedule in which you started eating, for instance, at 10 a.m. and you stopped eating at 6 p.m. An absolutely dreadful schedule for anyone that wants to have some semblance of a normal life. In my opinion, it's not really compatible with most schedules, although some people might be able to do it. Maybe you and your family or your friends, you're eating a late breakfast and then you're having a late-ish lunch around 2 p.m. and then you have dinner at 6, assuming that you go to bed around 9:30 or 10 p.m. That is going to extract the maximum amount of weight-related, body fat-related, metabolic factor-related aspects of time-restricted feeding. Some people tend to fall into a category where they do best placing that feeding window later in the day, and provided it doesn't run too close to your sleep. Remember, you need a 2 or 3 hour buffer before your sleep where you're not ingesting anything in order to extract the benefits of time-restricted feeding. Well, then starting your feeding window at 12 p.m. and ending it at 8 p.m. plus or minus half an hour day to day seems like a perfectly reasonable schedule. For some people, starting at 2 p.m. and ending at 10 p.m. Of course, you have to take into consideration when you exercise, if you exercise. For instance, I like to exercise early in the day if I run or if I do some moderate or light intensity exercise. Regardless of what type of exercise it is, I have no trouble waiting until my feeding window kicks in around noon or even 2 p.m. But if I do high intensity weight training, for instance, early in the day, or if I run sprints and I do that at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., by 11 a.m., I am very, very hungry and it's hard for me to do other things, concentrate, etc. Now, I'm not neurotic about my feeding window. As I mentioned before, I kind of let it expand and contract a bit around the 8-hour mark and feel perfectly free to do that too. We're talking here in ideals, not in necessarily practicals. But other people find that they're very hungry when they wake up early in the day. If you're one of these people, or you're somebody who really is trying to emphasize hypertrophy or maintenance of muscle, then it does seem that ingesting protein early in the day is beneficial, that it can be more readily converted into muscle tissue. And this has been demonstrated in at least one study. There's another study underway that's exploring this further. For people that are really, really interested in hypertrophy and building muscle, well then time-restricted feeding is usually not the way they go. I mean, let's be honest, there are many people out there who are eating 4 or more meals per day, and they're doing that from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. I realize that not everybody is overweight. There is an obesity crisis. Indeed, the percentage of obesity and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is just cosmic through the roof, at least in this country and in other countries as well. This country meaning the U.S., but other countries as well. But there are, of course, people that are trying to gain weight or who don't want to lose weight or who are trying to maximize physical performance or hypertrophy or things of that sort. And so, of course, time-restricted feeding for them might be as long as I'm awake, I'm eating. And I tip my hat to those people and just say, provided you understand what you're doing and the burden that places on some of the other processes in your body, if that's right for you, then by all means pursue that. And then, of course, we discussed how making sure that you're ingesting enough fluids, in particular water, and salt, especially if you're using caffeine in order to increase your levels of alertness, regardless of where that caffeine source comes from, coffee, tea, or otherwise, that can cause the excretion of sodium and can lead to a kind of shakiness, a lightheadedness. But for most people, maintaining relatively low to modest blood glucose levels is going to be pretty healthy and will allow all the positive effects of intermittent fasting to occur. And when you find that reaching that start to the feeding window is challenging, that ingesting sodium can often stabilize your system mentally and physically and allow you to reach that window, often painlessly. And then as a final point, as I mentioned earlier, provided that they are consumed in low or modest amounts, artificial sweeteners or plant-based non-sugar, non-caloric sweeteners don't seem to really impact blood glucose to the extent that it would, quote unquote, take you out of your fast. But that, like fat fasting, is something that's going to be highly individual and that you're going to have to experiment with for yourself. And being able to recognize when you're in a fast and when you're out of a fast at a subjective level and not constantly having to measure your blood glucose or do things of that sort can be beneficial. And I think if you watch for the feelings associated with eating and post-eating foods of different kinds and different amounts, and you watch for the feelings associated with being fasted for long periods of time or short periods of time, of having gotten sufficient sunlight, of having trained hard or not trained hard earlier that day, etc., you can do the most important thing, which is to start to learn to evaluate your own system, to run simple, safe experiments on your system in a way that allows you to really establish the ideal nutrition schedule for you, whether it be time-restricted feeding, aka intermittent fasting, or some other nutritional plan.